magnificent land of Tampa, Florida. Rabbi Yaakov Couple Silverberg. Applause. Standing ovation, please. Okay. Let us dedicate our Torah study today to we are following the unfortunate events unfolding in Surfside, Florida, and the collapsed building there. There's a whole lot that remains unknown. Apparently, there's a lot of missing people, close to 100 missing people. One of the most concentrated Jewish areas probably in the world, certainly outside of Israel. It's bar none the most concentrated Jewish area, maybe Brooklyn, New York, and then that area of Florida. Is that accurate? Yeah. So it is a building packed with Jews, and the list of names is it's pretty. As I was reading it just tonight after Mincha in Shul, it's how long that list is of names. I'm sure there are people here whose names were not on that list. Anyways, we pray for their miraculous salvation. Amen. And we'll study for that merit. Okay. So we got started with some of these. Again, we started last week on these. Again, as I mentioned last week, one of the strangest areas of the Talmud, because it shares stories which are straight out of like a Dr. Seuss book. And
what page?
Page in the Gemara, it's Ayin Gimel. And as we spoke a little bit last week about the different opinions and how to understand these stories, or in general, how to understand the fantastical stories of the Talmud. Do we take them literally? And we basically pointed, if you look in the commentaries, you come across three different opinions of how to understand these stories. Some say take it literally. Some say, although very few would probably take the stories we're going to read today literally. I find it hard to imagine that even the commentaries will say that you should take other areas of miraculous stories literally. These stories, I think, I'm going to assume that most say should not be taken literally. And then there's someone say that there was some event that took place and it's just exaggerated. And then the third approach is that it's all a parable, and these stories, you don't have to take them literally at all. They were just shared as parables with lessons. And as we did last week, we went through a few stories and shared the now. The Gemara just shared the story, which leads the parable or the interpretation of it up for discussion. And that's where you have several commentaries to focus on. And most of the commentaries in the Talmud don't spend time on these Gemaras. They kind of skip it over and get back to the practical stuff and the theoretical, the more the Talmudic dialogue, but the story parts, most of the commentaries don't focus on. Some do. And in these stories, you have different commentaries. And as we're going to see that sometimes the explanation of these stories can be vastly different from one another.
But if it might be fiction, how come he said that I heard this story from the sailor or whatever it was last time?
Why can't it be? That's a good question. But why can't it be that the sailors share with me this tale, and I understand. For them, it was a tale, and therefore I'm sharing what they said. And for me, it was a lesson. It's a good point, but again, to read these stories and take them literally is a great stretch. You'll see. I mean, we already started last week, and I think it gets even crazier this week. Saying that the sailor said it to me is maybe just another way of starting a story with a mashal. All right. Let me find it over here. I'm looking for the shot. Give me just a moment. Okay, so let's move on to the story we are at, which I think is the third story. Last week we focused on two. Remember, we spoke about that the white-tipped wave, which is the wave is the Yetzer Hara, which can crush even the greatest ship. Is the Yetzer Hara, is the evil inclination, and the white fiery tip is that each part is precise. Fire represents the passion of the evil inclination. The white, which is at the edge, represents that often it begins with a pure motive. The Sahara starts with some sort of pure agenda and it immediately leads us into a destructive agenda. So that was last week. Now, let's jump into the third story. If you're following, it's 73A4 in the art scroll. If you have it on Savaria, it's 73A towards the bottom of the page. And here's our Rabbah. Rabbah said, Lididi Chazili, I saw, Lididi Chazili, to me it was seen. Some say those words, Lididi Chazili, which is unlike Matan, like he said, the sailors told me, like he says, maybe it was a dream. Some say that this was a dream. Lididi Chazili, it was a dream. The Ritzvah says that this is the saying that this was a dream. Okay, so then we can actually take it literally. He saw this in a dream. What did he see? Hurmin, some people pronounce it as Hurmiz, Bar Lilit. There is a shade. A shade is a demon. I saw the demon Hormin or Hormiz, the son of Lilit. Kikarohit akupya de shura de mechuza. That he was running along the walls of the city, or the battlement of the walls of the city of Mechuzah. So this demon named Hormiz was running along the walls of the city of Mechuzah. Virohit parsha, kirochim chayvasa mitatai. And beneath these walls, there was a cavalryman who was riding on an animal beneath him, velo yachile, and he could not reach him. Now, there's two different ways of understanding the words he could not reach him. It could be that Hormiz, this demon, could not reach the cavalryman, or it could be, as some interpreters, that the cavalryman couldn't reach Hormiz. So it's not clear, but one of them could not catch up to the other one. Zimna Chanah, continuing in this vision, again, it's like a dream, often doesn't exactly one lead to the other, doesn't have a very clear connection, one element to the next. He says there was one time about this, again, back to this Hormiz. There was two mules which were saddled, the Kaiman, and these two mules were sitting at Trei Gishri Dirugnar on the two bridges of the city Rugnar. Vishoyer Mehai Lahai, and this demon jumped from the back of one donkey to the other, to mule to the other. Vinoki Trei Nizgi de Chamr Biyade, and he held two cups of wine in his hand. And he was pouring it. Umoyrik Mehai Lahai, talk about a real, what do you call it? These people who get up in the show do all sorts of acrobatics. And he was jumping back and forth between the backs of these two mules on two different bridges, pouring wine into two cups. And he didn't spill a drop. In case you're thinking maybe it was a calm day, and that's why he was able to do this trick. Yalu Shamayim Yerdu Tohemisava was the day in which the waves and the winds were up and down from the heavens to the earth. Until the king heard about it and killed him. That's our story. And now, as I did last week, we can open it up for interpretation. Before we get into the commentary, would anybody like to take a stab at it and guess what exactly is the symbolism or the lesson or the metaphor that this story is trying to share? Again, we have this Hormiz, the demon Hormiz. Again, demon is not something we're very familiar with, but it's certainly brought down in the Talmud that exists, who is the son of Lilit. Anybody here ever heard of Lilit? Yes? Okay. So somehow that's important over here. On the walls, first is on the walls of Mechuzah, and then can't catch a cavalryman who's on now. Then it shifts to two mules that are on two bridges, wine. Anyone like to?
The two stories are one, or
It's one part of yes, it's one story. He does not share his two separate stories.
no, but the idea, like the
It's somehow it's all connected, yes, because he shares it as one of these 21 stories. This is one.
Yetzer hara.
Can't Yetzer hara explanation. That's just the easy go-to one. Yeah, Yetzer hara. A demon, Yetzer hara.
When COVID.
Right, due to COVID.
When you are going to do a mitzvah, like the Yetzer hara cannot attack you, cannot,
Okay.
and because of that, he couldn't chase the.
Okay. Somehow he was not able to catch up to this person. Okay. So actually very fascinating. So as I pointed out, there's two different commentaries that I was looking at as I was reviewing. One which was brought in the article is the commentary of the Gra, the Vilna Gaon, and the other is the commentary of the Maharsha. Yes.
So can I take a stab at it before?
Go for it.
So my thoughts are, God was with this man that he couldn't catch, so he was protected. Even though this demon was capable of miraculous things, not spilling any of this wine with the donkeys weren't
Not donkeys, mules, and that's important. We'll get to that.
Okay, so the mules. So like even though he could do all these feats, it didn't matter. He still couldn't touch this guy because he was under Hashem's protection.
Okay. All right. There was some sort of protection, but why was he protected? Well, what was there? Is there any indication as to what allowed him to be protected from this powerful demon?
What was his job title again? Did it say?
It didn't say what? Did it
say what his job title was? What he was doing?
It doesn't say. It says a cavalryman.
That means a military person.
Okay.
And what man?
He was on the walls of the city of Mechuzah.
Is it a real place?
Mechuzah is a real place. Yes, absolutely. It is a real place in Babylonia.
Oh,
Yeah, which was a center or one of the centers of Jewish life. Okay, let's get right into it. Very interesting. So, who is this Hormin or Hormis? Who is, when we talk about demons or these somewhat celestial, powerful entities, and the Talmud does talk about shading. Talks about, in fact, Rashi. When Rashi commented, Rashi does not get into all of the Mishal and the Nimshal. Rashi just says one simple thing over here. He says, over here, V'hai Uvda, Rashi says, this story is to tell us, just to tell us God's kindness. Shemirachim al briyosah, that God is merciful on his creations. Notice, Rashi says very simple. He doesn't get into all the details. He just says, you should know that at the walls of your city, there are destructive entities. And you don't even realize, one of the things I feel like COVID taught us is you have no idea what destruction could be out there, right? COVID is a tiny little virus particle. No, you can't see it, and it could be everywhere. So Rashi says very basic. Here you have a destructive demon, which is at the walls of the city, and as was figured out, this person was protected from it. You never know when you're driving in your vehicle and you drive by, I don't know, the walls of the city, who knows what you're being protected from. So that's what he says. Rashi's saying, just be aware that God is protecting you even when you don't know it. And he says, and the other message is, the Gam, another message this story meant to teach, Shalom leitis b'derech yachid. Don't travel alone. This is something we come across. Today we don't, for a long time, we don't focus on or emphasize the idea of these demons, and there's this tradition that the demons no longer have the power they used to have, whatever. But the point is, he's saying that a person shouldn't travel alone at night because there may be forces, destructive forces out there. So Rashi has a very basic, simple approach to the story, saying there are forces of evil out there, God is protecting you, but still there's certain steps you should take. It says specifically, don't go into a churva. Churva means a desolate, broken down edifice at night, because that's where the shaven hang out. So that's Rashi's simple takeaway here. Let's go to some of the deeper understandings which go into the details of the story. Who is Hormis? So Hormis apparently is, when we talk about a demon or a force of evil, represents, the Gemara states, Hormis is brought down in Gemara Sanhedrin 39. The Gemara there states that the upper half of a person's body is godly. This is something which we come across. Whereas the lower part of a person's body is what's called Hormis's domain. The lower half of the body belongs to Hormis. The lower half is not necessarily the half, but the upper half of the body is referring to the mind, the heart, our intellect, our emotion. The lower part of the body, the digestive system, our stomach, our reproductive organs, these are all Hormiz's domain. That's where our animalistic tendencies come from. That's where we are really no different than an animal. So the upper part of the body, which is what's our human component, belongs to us, or belongs to God, or should belong to God. And the lower half of the body belongs to Hermes. That's what the Gemara Sanhedrin says, which tells us that Hormuz, or Hormin, spelled differently in different places, represents the human animalistic pursuit of bodily pleasure. That is what this person. So it's not just bad, not just gates are bad, but there's specific elements within evil. And this is the pursuit for bodily pleasure. Similarly, I mentioned earlier the name Lilith. And several people said, you've heard of Lilith. Who is Lilith? What is that?
She's the wife of the Satan.
Wife of the Satan. What does that mean? You know, who's the rabbi that married her? Who's the...
I heard that you shouldn't even say her name.
Right.
And,
But the Gemara says it, so I think we're okay to say it as long as we're starting saying it directly from the words of the Gemara. But like Hormuz, it represents something. It's not just when we talk about a Satan, a demonic force. It's not just under the umbrella of bad. There must be something specific. So Lilith also represents this. According to the Zohar, she is the demon who entices men to engage in illicit pleasures. So the same thing as Hormuz. I don't think anybody here relates to any of that. But theoretically, we know that it's out there somewhere. And they're the idea of the pleasures which are forbidden or inappropriate. This is the seduction of this female, whatever you want to call it, demon or whatever, that's where it comes from. So basically, if we connect the two, right, we're talking about this Hormuz, the son of Lilith, it's basically a metaphor for the animalistic pursuits of human beings, specifically perhaps the animalistic sexual pursuits which exist. Okay, so now we know who this entity is, at least metaphorically. This is, by the way, the Gemara. The Marshat does not go along these lines. He just speaks a more general. Anyway, what's the wall? Dancing along the wall. It was along the wall of Mechuzah. The wall we find in numerous places is a reference to Torah. Torah is considered to be a wall of protection. I don't want to get into the politics of building a wall on the border or not building a wall on the border. But the fact is that the wall is considered to be the protective force of Torah, is called the wall. It so happens, so the wall, so here you have these dueling forces. You have the force of seduction, of animalistic pursuit, and this wall is the wall of Torah. Now, remember, what was the name of the city that this took place? The city of Mechuzah. Mechuzah was not just a real city, it was considered to be a very great Torah city. It was a city in which the people were involved in Torah study. Mechuzah was one of the Torah centers. However, if you look in the Gemara, Rosh Hashanah, Yud Zayin Amadal, page 17a, it says that even the best of Mechuzah, which is a city, again, connected to Torah, are destined to Gehenna. The best of Mechuzah are going to go to Gehenna. Why? Why do they go to Gehenna? Now, when we talk about Gehenna, which is translated as hell, it's important to understand. It's not the definition that exists in the world nowadays. When you say this person is going to hell, that means like eternal hell. Judaism doesn't believe in that. When you say this person is even the best are going to hell, it means the best require the cleansing process of Gehenna. So even the best of Mechuzah, who study Torah, nevertheless, there's something wrong about their behavior, and they have to go through Gehenna. Why? Why would the best of Mechuzah, Torah center, have to go to Gehenna? So it says, the Gemara says over there, the reason is because they pampered themselves. Because they studied Torah, but they pampered themselves. I'm not going to suggest that our studying Torah, they're eating chocolate. I don't think our eating chocolate is all divine. We don't do anything over here to pamper ourselves. But over here, they studied Torah, but then, they wanted to make sure they had the luxury car and the luxury lifestyle, and they had their vacations lined up. They studied Torah, but then they pampered themselves. So the Gemara says because of that pampering, they had to they have to go through a cleansing process. The Gemara takes it a step further. It says it wasn't only that they studied Torah and then they also were involved in their pampering of themselves. He says no, the Torah itself was done for the purpose of pampering themselves, and then they did so for self-gratification. You can study Torah without the goal of studying Torah to connect to God. You study Torah just to attend to my own personal gratification. It could be gratification in intellectual pursuit. I enjoy it. I love it. And therefore, I enjoy myself. The person who studies Torah for themselves is lacking the true idea of Torah, which is you study Torah, and even if you do enjoy it, nothing wrong with enjoying Torah. That's a person should enjoy Torah, but ultimately, the goal of Torah study should be to connect to Hashem. So the people in Mechalza were involved, even though they studied Torah, but they were too involved in self-indulgence. So here you have the, now we kind of see things coming together. Hormuz, the son of Lilith, is the demon involved in self-gratification, and he's dancing on the walls, which represents the Torah of the cities, because the Torah they were studying was not done properly. Because it was too much, they allowed, so to say, Hormuz to get involved in their wall, in the Torah study they had. However, there was one person, remember the cavalryman, who was riding an animal. What does that represent? A cavalryman riding an animal represents someone who is in control of their animal. The idea of riding the animal to the destination you need to go, or whatever, means that the metaphoric idea behind the human being riding an animal is a human, represents, again, going back to what the Talmud says, the idea that the top half of the body belongs to God, the bottom half of the body belongs to Hormuz. Very strange idea. This demon of self-indulgence. When a human is riding the animal, it's a way of saying human's in control. That the divine part is in control of the animal and is using the animal to serve God. That's the goal, right? The goal is not to get rid of the animal within us. The goal is not to live a life what's that? Of Nizirut, right? Of abstinence. That's not the goal. The goal is to eat and to drink and to procreate, all these things which you're meant to do, to use the body, but doing so with the human being in control, like the human riding an animal. So the human riding an animal beneath represents that one person in the city who was in control of their animalistic tendencies. He wasn't studying Torah and under the pursuit of self-indulgence. That's why it says that person, Hormuz couldn't catch up to. Hormuz, that person was going faster, and Hormuz couldn't catch that person. Yes?
That person is a cavalryman, did you say?
So I don't know, he doesn't get into cavalryman, but what does that mean? Robert said cavalryman has to do with the idea of a soldier, which connects to this idea well also. A person who was disciplined and controlled. Couldn't catch up. Okay, so that is the first part of the story. Then we shift, and over here, still continuing along those lines. So then it says, Hormuz was given 2 mules. Why 2 mules? Because a mule is a curse. Why? Because a mule does not procreate. The mule is the end. The mule does not have any descendants. What is the mule? Mule is the offspring of a horse and a donkey, right? And they cannot then, there's no continuation after. So it's basically saying, when you get caught up, that represents Hormuz, because getting caught up in the physical pleasures of life, there's no result. It doesn't lead to anything positive. It doesn't lead to anything. Just like a mule has no continuation. This world is when we get involved in our indulgence in this world, we're involving ourselves in something which is temporary. What's the lashon in the Gemara? That when someone puts aside Torah mitzvahs, the pursuit of physical pursuits, so you're maniach chai olam, that you're sacrificing eternal good for temporary. So Hormuz represents temporary. Therefore, he says that's why it says the 2 mules represent the idea of temporary. The mules will not continue. 2 mules. Wine again comes back to the same idea, which is wine represents indulgence. Therefore, he's drinking the wine. He jumps back and forth. What does he explain the difference between back and forth between the 2 rivers? Again, the river Donag. Why Donag? Because Donag also represents temporary. Donag is another meaning of Donag is wax. Donag is wax. Wax melts in the presence of fire. So Donag is another way of saying both the mule and the Donag is a way of saying this is temporary. Don't get caught up in that which is temporary, because it's not going to last. And again, the wine also represents the idea of physical indulgence, physical pursuit. And God, it says, the King of the universe, this is going to the conclusion of the story, the King of the universe, which is God, patiently awaits man's repentance And that's why eventually Horman's unhappy career comes to an end without his having achieved anything worthwhile. This is how the Gra explains this story. The Maharsha, I don't want to go into length of Maharsha's explanation, but he takes a different approach to this. He says that Horman represents just the Yetzer Hara. He agrees with that notion that the wall represents Torah. And he says the Yetzer Hara, an interesting idea. He says the Yetzer Hara attacks the Jews first. The Yetzer Hara inclination first goes after the Jew. The Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, the pursuit of all things wrong, says first tries to attack the Jew. Therefore, his starting point is the walls of Mechuzah, which is the walls of Torah. And he tries to find weakness within the walls. Maharsha says, where's the weakness of within Torah? Where's there the weak link of Torah? So he says it actually connects to the idea from a couple weeks ago, the Torah portion. He says the weak link within Torah are the mitzvahs which don't make sense. That's where the Yetzer Hara waits in ambush, so to say. This one is waits in ambush when it comes to the mitzvah which is illogical. The mitzvahs which make sense. Charity, kindness, respect parents, don't kill, don't steal, maybe even Shabbos and the holidays. The Yetzer Hara says, I'm not going to be able to make an inroads into the Jewish mind there, but I'll find the weakness within the wall. Apparently, the Gemara says he was waiting in the crevice of the wall, like finding a weakness within the wall. We all study Torah. Torah is our wall of strength. The question is there a weakness within that wall? Is there a place within that wall where I'm a little bit more susceptible to the power of the Yetzer Hara? And that's where Hormuz waits, and he tries to attack us there. And the Gemara, Maharsha explains the story that he's unsuccessful, and therefore he moves on to you see the story kind of shifts in the middle, right? So suddenly he's in the bridges. That's where he says once he finds he can't be successful in weakening the resolve of the Jewish people, he moves on to the other nations of the world, which he says the two bridges represent the other nations of the world, and over there he's more successful. There he is able to convince with the wine and with the indulgence, self-indulgence. Over there he makes inroads, and ultimately, whatever, Hormuz is wiped out. But that's the Maharsha's approach, slightly different, or significantly different than what the Gra says, but with an interesting twist, that Hormuz's idea of waiting within the walls is finding the weakness, trying to find the weakness. Maharsha also understands that cavalryman as the person who is strong in their Torah study, and therefore Hormuz is unable to catch up to them. So the goal of this is for all of us to be that cavalry person. That's the goal of this mashal, to be that person, to recognize the threat of Hormuz, recognize the threat of our indulgence, not to let our Torah be tainted by that pursuit of indulgence. And as long as we harness the animal within us and ride it like that cavalryman, then even the great power of Hormuz, who comes with the power of Lilith, will not be able to catch up. So that is the explanation of story number 4. Do we have time? Yeah, okay. Let's move on to story number, that was number 3. Let's move on to story number 4. Okay, it's a short story. And here we have Amar Rabbah, the same Rabbah. Rabbah, the grandson of Chanah, says like this: Lididi Chazili, I saw Urzila bar Yoine, a young, he says Urzila is a re'aim. We'll get to a re'aim in a moment. I saw a re'aim which was 1 day old. A re'aim, which is a powerful animal which was 1 day old. Tahava kehar Tabor, which was the size of Mount Tabor. I saw this animal the size of a mountain. Tomorrow pauses and says, the Har Tabor Kamahavi. How big is this Har Tabor? He's saying it's the size of a mountain. Okay, how big is that mountain? So the Gemara says, Arba Parsei, 4 parsei. We said last week, a parsei is approximately 2.something miles. Fine. So this is a mile. This is a mountain which was 4 parsa, 8 miles circumference. And then it says, and then he just goes on to describe how big the animal was. The length of the animal's neck was 3 parsa. Ubei marbata dereshe parsa upada. And the resting place for its head was a parsa and a half. And then, when you have such an animal, it leads to some unique challenges. You have an animal which is that size, and here's a unique challenge that this animal represents, and that was Rama Kufta. It excreted dung. The Sacharle Liyardana, and it dammed the Jordan River. Gemara says it excreted so much that its excrement caused the Jordan River to temporarily dam or jam up. So that's the story. The end. And he lived happily ever after. It doesn't say that. But this is much shorter, simpler. What could possibly be the explanation of this fourth story? What is this giant animal? Somehow it's do you feel like Kiddush? Precisely. Oh boy. Okay, so I'm actually going to go straight to briefly the Maharsha gives a whole explanation of this is referring to Joshua. The story of Joshua. Joshua is referred to as Re'aim. Okay, that's his explanation and the history of the story of Joshua as he conquered Israel through Jericho. That's how he explains this story. But that's a nice explanation. But I want to share from the Vilna Gaon because he shares an explanation, which again I think shares a very profound and practical lesson. The Re'aim. What is the Re'aim? This animal called a Re'aim. Wazila is a Re'aim. What is a Re'aim? We come across numerous explanations of what the Re'aim is. It apparently is a huge animal. Even in its literal meaning, without getting into the size of this animal, it's an enormous animal. Most common translation of it, or one of the translations of it, I should say, is a giant buffalo. As you probably know, a giant buffalo, wild buffalo, are, in fact, enormous, powerful animals. Okay, so now we know what the animal is. What exactly is this referring to? What does it mean? The animal, he saw it, and it was 1 day old. Here's what the Gra says. An important rule, says the Gra, in studying Torah, is that before one attempts to be an analytical power in Torah study, you first have to study a lot. Before you get up there and start giving your interpretations and explanations and challenges and rebuttals, you simply have to cover ground. You have to spend a lot of time studying Torah before you can claim to be an expert and someone who is able to then challenge others in the field of Torah. You see this. You see sometimes if someone studies a little bit, and suddenly they feel they have the cockiness that, yeah, that's it, I'm ready. Now I can get up there and I can, you hear from, Judaism, such a huge emphasis is on the respect we have for the wisdom which is accumulated over time, right? Even there's this idea in general that if you see someone who is older, one is supposed to respect and they say v'takum because of someone who's old. You should stand up in the presence of someone who's older. There's wisdom that comes through experience, and certainly when one is older but also has spent a lot of time studying Torah, there's a humility in the presence of such a scholar. And over here, it's coming to talk about an entity which does not have that. A person who, unfortunately, doesn't miss that lesson. Therefore, he says like this. The Re'aim is a person who studies Torah. The horns of the Re'aim represents, it was known as an animal which fought, which was a fierce fighter. The Re'aim represents the horns of someone who fights. This story, says the Gra, concerns the shortcoming of a vain Torah student who at the very beginning of his studies already imagines himself to have reached the heights of scholarship. And that's the meaning. He feels that he could already voice his opinion and argue. On his first day, he is already fighting like a Re'aim. And that's the meaning that Rabbah says, I saw a Re'aim which was 1 day old, which means I came across a fighting animal, the animal who carries the burden of Torah, but it's 1 day old. Why are you fighting? You're not ready to fight. First, consume as much Torah as you can. First, build yourself into an entity. You're 1 day old. You shouldn't be fighting. Why does it say, remember it says it was the size of Mount Tabor. What's the idea behind the animal being the size of Mount Tabor? So, if you go to the Gemara, This is why you have a genius who's able to not only be holy, but know all of Torah at his fingertips, someone like the God. He says, the Gemara in Megillah talks about, you may be familiar with it's a medrash, which talks about the various mountains that God considered for the giving of Torah. Ever heard this idea? That God, that there was other mountains in the area. Mount Sinai was not the most prestigious mountain in that area. And the Gemara goes through the other mountains which were considered. And one of the mountains which was considered was Har Tabor. So Har Tabor was a candidate for the giving of the Torah. Can you imagine everything would be different? All the hospitals would be Mount Tabor hospital.
We have wine in Mount Tabor. It's pretty good.
Oh yeah? Oh, interesting. So Mount Tabor, right. Tabor, so Mount, I wonder if it's...
I wonder what you're going to say about it. I'm really curious.
No?
It was a horrible mountain.
I don't want to cause this winery to lose business. But the reason why Mount Tabor was
sure
disqualified is because it was considered to be haughty. So the mountain, now what that means, I don't know. It doesn't mean that a mountain is haughty. That requires its own explanation. But the Talmud says that Mount Tabor was disqualified from being the site at which the Torah was given because of its haughtiness.
Could it be, was it a lot higher up and more like aesthetically nice?
Right, I guess so.
That's what I'm guessing.
I guess so, but obviously the mountain doesn't, not trying to do it, but that's a good point, right? So obviously it was just the physical feature was beautiful and it represents haughtiness, and therefore God said you're not the appropriate
No, to Phil's,
site for
well, to Phil's point, it says that, I don't know where it says in Rashi or whatever, it says that on Sinai, Har Sinai was a very medium-sized mountain.
Right.
It was not too haughty and it was
Right,
not
so
too
that's
humble.
correct. So what he's adding is because it looked beautiful. My point is, and the reason we don't want to
It wasn't a humble
misunderstand that to
mountain.
mean-
You can say the same thing. It wasn't a humble mountain.
Right. The point, I guess my point is that we want to, that you're correct, but we shouldn't think that being beautiful or large is an indication of arrogance in life. It's just me, because someone can have the qualities but still be humble about it. But yes, that's why it's Mount Tabor. So Mount Tabor was disqualified, and therefore we now connect it up. So the new student of our story is as vain as Har Tabor. Actually, as we say, true understanding comes with age. As the Mishnah says, when do you achieve age? When do you achieve wisdom? According to Pirkei Avos, when do you achieve Bina? No, Shivim is
Arba'in.
Arba'in, 40. 40 years old. I don't want to ask anybody their age over here. I'm not 40. But the 40 years old is when you achieve...
Why are you so quick to
Yeah.
tell? So quick to
Why?
tell?
You go downhill. when you turn 40.
Over here it says in your 40 is when you achieve wisdom. Well, so I don't know. Maybe this is for aim is a little bit of a offense to me. The idea is you study Torah. The person who's under 40, that he starts studying Kabbalah at 40. The person who's under 40 who feels that they are now obviously. Let's contrast this with an important lesson, which is that at any age in life, you're able to teach someone else. Like the Rabbi said, if you know how to teach others, which means even a 10-year-old has the ability to teach someone else. But there's a difference between teaching that which you know and feeling the authority to be a fighter within them. That's what it is. It's not a problem to teach. You can teach. We do have exceptions to this too, right? In Nagada, we talk about Ben Azariah at the age of 17. He was already capable as like a 7-year-old. But the general rule is that the idea of one should have the arrogance or the assumption, certainly in the presence of older people, that they can, go face off and go eye to eye, with the scholar is a arrogance and is a destructive arrogance. And then he goes on to explain the different measurements inside the 4 parcels. He says, when he sees, what's the end of the story, which is an interesting conclusion, right? When he sees that he is not acknowledged, when this student who's in the presence of scholars, real scholars, sees that he's not acknowledged, he becomes jealous of other Torah scholars, and therefore resorts to negating them. When this sharp, arrogant young scholar sees, I'm not giving the respect, so he becomes jealous, and he's jealous of the other scholars. And it says the Jordan River in the story represents the other Torah scholars. That's what the Jordan River represents. This one day Re'aim, this one day old, arrogant scholar fouls them and dams their flow. In other words, he temporarily gets in the way of the sages who are trying to share the water, the wisdom. The Jordan water is for sure connected to Torah. So the Jordan River, which flows with Torah, is the Torah of the true sages. And this person, because now he's offended that he wasn't recognized for his brilliance, even though Judaism requires more than brilliance, it requires time and wisdom and age, which comes with age. So therefore, this Re'aim gets in the way, and that which she excretes gets in the way of the true scholarly wisdom of the scholars, which is the Jordan River. Of course, the blockage is only temporary. Soon the blockage is carried away, and the pure water flows forth again. This story teaches how pride leads to jealousy, which in turn leads to vilification. So a very fascinating story with, I think, a very profound and practical lesson. Okay, you know what? We may have to stop here. We only got through last week 2 stories, this week 2 stories.
It just take us 9 weeks to finish it all.
I'll just start the next one. Rabbah said, he said, I'll say the story and I'll leave the interpretation for next week. I saw Hahi Akrukta. Who can guess what animal an Akrukta is?
Spider?
No.
Elephant.
No.
Krukta?
Krukta is a frog. Croak. It croaks. Akrukta. So he says, I saw a frog. The Havaki Akra the Hagrunya, which was the size of the city of Akra of Hagrunya. Akra of Hagrunya of Kamahave. How big is Akra of Hagrunya? Shitim Bati is the size of 60 houses. Also, Tanina Blah, a sea monster came and ate the frog. Also, Pushkansa Ubla Tanina, a female raven came and ate the sea monster. The Salik Yasib Ilana and then sat in a tree. Says the Gemara, Tachazi, come and see, come and up the Shkel Ilana, what a strong tree that is. Papa Bar Shmuel says, Iloha Hassan Lohini. Had I not been there myself, I would not have believed it. All right, so that's the story. You have a week to figure it out. Next week, we will come back and we'll share the 2 different interpretations.
I'm pretty sure I know where to look, but
2 different interpretations of that story. And with that, we'll conclude today's class. Again, the best lessons we learned. The first one is a rather complex one about Hormuz, this powerful entity of this demon, however you understand it, demon which is the demon, the pursuit of animalistic indulgence and sexual indulgence, and it waits at the wall. The wall represents the Torah power, and even our Torah power could be tainted by pursuit of indulgence, or alternatively, as the Maharsha says, tries to find the weak link within our Torah study where he can attack us. And as long as we are that cavalryman riding the donkey, or riding an animal, let's say which animal, riding an animal, we can outpace the power of the Sahara. And the second lesson is this lesson about this Re'aim, this powerful animal that's 1 day old, which is that if a person studies Torah, maybe other fields, you can be arrogant early on. If you have the shrewdness and the sharpness, you can be successful. In other fields, you really can. A person, today, you can achieve extraordinary wealth at a very young age. It's unlikely, but it can happen. So you can, a person is measured, wealth is measured by dollars and cents. So someone who is 65 years old and is worth $1 billion is no wealthier than the person who is 20 years old is worth $1 billion. But in Torah, that's not the way it is. You can't say, well, I studied this amount, they studied this amount, so we're the same. No. In Torah, that day-old wisdom is not nearly as valuable as the wisdom which is acquired over time and over experience. And that's the mistake of this Re'aim, this young day-old animal which thinks that it has the ability to attack and to be right on par with the other animals. And when it realizes that it's not accepted, it gets angry and it tries to follow up the true pure waters of the Torah scholars, but even that is only temporary. And obviously the lesson is to have the humility in Torah study. All right, that we conclude. We got some food and maybe in about 20 minutes we can dot and